Night came early on the Russian steppe. It always did. In wartime, darkness wasn't just a natural rhythm, it was a weapon. It was fear. It was cover. And for the women of the 558th Night Bomber Regiment, it was home. The year was 1942. The German Wehrmacht had punched deep into Soviet territory, seizing towns, burning villages, destroying railways, and leaving behind a trail of devastation that stretched from the Baltic to the Caucasus. Moscow and Stalingrad were under threat. Entire divisions had been shattered. Every hour the front shifted, sometimes by miles, sometimes by inches. And in this desperate hour, the Soviet Union took an extraordinary step, one that would shock the world and terrify the German army. They formed an all-female air combat unit. Not support staff, not nurses, not clerks. Combat pilots, bombers, warriors of the night. The idea came from Marina Roskova, the Soviet Union's most famous female aviator, known as the Russian Amelia Earhart. She had flown record-breaking distance missions, survived crash landings, and become a national celebrity. When the war began, thousands of women wrote to her, begging to serve, begging for a chance to fight not behind the men, but beside them. Roskova took their letters to Stalin himself, and against all military conventions, he agreed. 3 all-female regiments were born: the 556th Fighter Regiment, the 587th Dive Bomber Regiment, and the most unlikely of all, the 558th Night Bombers. They would become the Night Witches. The women arrived at Engels Air Base in early spring. Many were barely out of school, 17, 18, 19 years old. Some had never driven a car, much less flown an airplane. Others were experienced civilian pilots who had trained in aero clubs, but none had faced war. None had flown at night, under fire, while navigating only by moonlight and instinct. Their instructors, all men, were skeptical. Women? Bombers? This is madness, one captain muttered. But Marina Roskova gave her recruits no time to doubt themselves. Uniforms were redesigned to fit them, though redesigned often meant cutting, stitching, or tying belts with rope. Boots were oversized, gloves were too large. Everything was designed for men, but the women adapted. They always adapted. Their aircraft, however, shocked even the bravest among them. The Polikarpov P-02, a biplane, a wooden frame covered with canvas, open cockpit, no armor, top speed barely 150 kilometers per hour, slower than most cars, and so light that a well-aimed rifle shot could tear through its wings. This would be their bomber. Some laughed in disbelief, others stared in horror. The P-02 looked like something from another century, a fragile, creaking relic of early aviation. Yet its simplicity hid a deadly advantage. It could fly slow, low, and silent. And at night, silence was everything. Training was brutal. The women learned to navigate by the stars, to fly without radios, to load bombs by hand, and to maneuver their fragile planes in darkness so thick it felt like flying through ink. They learned to take off in minutes, evade searchlights, drop bombs from treetop height, and escape flak bursts that could shred their canvas wings. They trained until their hands blistered from the cold metal controls, until their eyes adapted to darkness, until fear became something they acknowledged but no longer bowed to. By June, they were ready. The 558th Night Bomber Regiment was deployed to the Southern Front, where German supply lines stretched thin across the plains. Bridges, railheads, fuel depots, and ammunition dumps were all vulnerable, and all within the P-02's striking reach. The women arrived at their new base, a rough airstrip cut into a forest clearing. Tents served as barracks, oil drums held fuel. There were no radios, no radar, no luxuries, but the regiment had spirit, and Marina Roskova behind them. On the first night of operations, the women prepared their planes under a sky heavy with stars. Mechanics tightened bolts, navigators checked maps, Pilots climbed into the open cockpits and secured their scarves and goggles, their breath fogged in the cold night air. "Remember," one commander said quietly, "you are shadows, you are ghosts. Do not let them see you coming." The engines sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. The PO2s lurched forward, their wooden frames vibrating, and then, one by one, they lifted into the night. The German soldiers stationed near the front heard nothing at first. No engines, no sirens, no roar of aircraft, only the chirping of crickets and the soft rustle of wind across the grass. Then, out of nowhere, a whisper. A faint swishing sound, like a broom sweeping across the sky. Then explosions. Bombs fell on ammunition dumps and fuel depots, igniting fireballs that turned the night orange. Trucks burned, soldiers scrambled, anti-aircraft gunners fired blindly, searching for targets they could not see. And then more whispers, more bombs, more chaos. The Germans were stunned. What were these silent planes? How could they appear from nowhere? Why did they fly so low, so slowly, so unpredictably? Soldiers swore they heard the sound of witches' brooms sweeping the air. The legend was born. Nachthexen, the night witches. By dawn, the women returned to base exhausted but triumphant. Their faces were blackened with smoke, their goggles frosted with dew. They drank water from metal cups and collapsed into bunks. They had flown their first combat mission and survived. Little did they know that the legend of the night witches had only begun. In the months ahead, they would fly hundreds of missions, face relentless anti-aircraft fire, endure sub-zero nights, and outmaneuver the Luftwaffe's best pilots. But nothing compared to what awaited them in the brutal winters to come, where survival was a miracle and every flight was a gamble with death. Night after night, the women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment climbed into their plywood biplanes and rose into the blackness above the Eastern Front. And by the winter of 1942, the Germans had learned a new phrase, whispered at first, then shouted in frustration whenever the faint rustle of wind approached overhead. They called them Nachthexen, the night witches. The name spread through German trenches like a superstition. Soldiers swore they heard broomsticks above the clouds. Others claimed the Soviets had trained witches to attack them. Some insisted they could see ghostly outlines drifting across the moon before explosives rained down. And while the stories were born from fear, the reality was far more remarkable. The night witches were not ghosts. They were not supernatural beings. They were young women, barely out of their teens, flying machines that should not have survived a single mission, and yet they flew hundreds. The training that should have broken them. In the wind-bitten training camps of Engels, the young recruits were pushed to the edge of exhaustion. Many had never flown before, most had never even driven a car. Yet they were expected to master navigation, mechanics, aerobatics, and night bombing in aircraft older than their instructors. Their training was relentless, 16-hour days, navigation drills in total darkness, blind landings on unmarked fields, bomb loading practice with frozen fingers, gear repairs done by lantern light in sub-zero temperatures. They were taught that errors at night were unforgiving. A single wrong heading could send them dozens of kilometers off course, straight over enemy territory, where searchlights waited like hungry wolves. Their instructors repeated one command: "Your plane is your sister. Protect her, trust her, she will bring you home." And slowly, the women learned to read the language of the sky. Wind shifts, cloud textures, the feeling of moisture on their cheeks indicating altitude changes. They learned to navigate by stars and the faint glow of rivers, and to land not by sight, but by instinct. Their aircraft,
the humble Po-2. The Polikapov Po-2 was built of canvas, plywood, and wire. It was a relic from an earlier era, originally designed for crop dusting and training, not war. Yet, in the hands of the night witches, it became a terror. The Germans mocked them at first. "Flying sewing machines," they laughed, until they realized that these machines could fly so low German radar couldn't detect them, turn so quickly that fighters overshot, glide so silently the only warning was the wind whispering across the wings. And so the attacks began. Slow at first, then relentless. Each night the women flew as many as 8 or 9 missions, landing only long enough to refuel, reload, and lift off again into the freezing dark. Their engines vibrated so violently their legs went numb. Their cheeks blistered from temperatures reaching -30 degrees Celsius. Their hands stiffened on the controls until they could no longer feel their fingers. But they kept flying, because every mission meant another defensive position destroyed, another German supply line severed, another inch of Soviet soil reclaimed. The tactic the Germans feared the most. The signature tactic of the night witches was simple and terrifying. They would approach silently, using only the moonlight to guide them. Then, a few hundred meters from their target, they cut their engines. The plane became a phantom, gliding noiselessly over the German camps. Soldiers on the ground would hear only a soft hiss, like fabric sliding through the night air. Then the bombs would fall. Searchlights scrambled, while machine guns spit fire into the sky. But by the time the Germans reacted, the night witches had already reignited their engines and slipped away into the black horizon. The tactic was so successful that German officers began offering an Iron Cross to any pilot who shot down a Po-2. Few ever collected. The cost of courage. But their daring came with a price. The Po-2 had no armor, no radio, no parachutes during the early months, no radar, no night vision instruments, and barely enough speed to stay airborne. When they were hit, there was no protection, only splintered wood, torn canvas, and open sky. Many crews never returned. Those who did learned to live with the sound of empty beds, with the silence of women who had once laughed, joked, and danced in the camp tents, with the knowledge that every night might be their last. Yet their grief never stopped them. They sewed patches onto their uniforms for luck. They carved names into their aircraft frames. They left letters inside the cockpit in case a final mission became truly final. And still, they rose into the night. The respect they earned on both sides. As the months passed, even German officers grudgingly acknowledged their skill. Captured diaries from Wehrmacht soldiers reveal, "They appear without warning. We cannot shoot them down. They are more precise than any bomber we face. They are not women, they are demons of the night." But to their fellow Soviet air units, the night witches were something else entirely. They were family. More than once, male pilots diverted missions to cover them. Ground crews risked shell fire to repair their Po-2s before sunset. Even hardened commanders removed their caps when a night witch plane limped home with holes in the wings. They were no longer girls or recruits. They were aviators, equal to any man in the sky. The mission that changed everything. In early 1943, the night witches were assigned a target deep behind enemy lines, one of the most dangerous they had ever faced. A heavily defended German fuel depot near the Kuban River. Dozens of searchlights, anti-aircraft cannons, machine gun nests arranged in spiraling rings. It was a mission no sane commander would assign to slow wooden aircraft. but the night witches volunteered. Their plan was daring. 3 crews would fly high to draw the searchlights. 2 would dive low to confuse the gunners. The remaining 4 would slip in silently and hit the fuel stores. The night sky erupted in chaos. Searchlights locked on the first wave, turning the aircraft into silhouettes against burning white. Tracer fire stitched the sky. Wooden ribs shattered. A wing tore open. One plane spiraled downward, vanishing behind the ridge. But the distraction worked. The bombers in the silent glide entered the perimeter. They dropped their bombs, each one landing cleanly. Moments later, the fuel depot ignited in a rolling explosion that lit the horizon like a second sunrise. German defenses faltered, supply trucks burned, radio operators panicked, and the night witches faded into the night, battered but victorious. It was the moment the German High Command issued a formal notice. Beware the women pilots. They are the most capable night bombers on the Eastern Front. The sisterhood that held them together. Despite the fear, the missions, the losses, the night witches maintained a bond beyond military duty. They sang before missions, their voices rising through the camp like prayers. They shared stolen chocolate bars and scratched gramophone records. They celebrated birthdays even during the heaviest bombardments. They slept side by side in cold dugouts, whispering stories of life before the war. And when one of their own did not return, they sat together, silent until dawn. Because grief was never carried alone, not in this regiment, not among these women. Their strength came from each other. By the spring of 1943, the night witches had flown thousands of missions, and the war was only growing darker. But the Germans had learned a hard truth. Even in the dead of night, danger could come on wooden wings, and the women who flew them were only getting better.
The night witches had survived the brutal winter campaigns, outmaneuvered German fighters, and struck targets far beyond what their fragile aircraft were ever designed to reach. But by mid-1943, the Eastern Front was undergoing a transformation. The Soviet counteroffensive was gaining momentum, the Wehrmacht was weakening, and the night witches, now battle-hardened veterans, were entering the most defining phase of their service: the rising tide of war. For months, the Soviet High Command had been preparing to launch critical offensives along the Southern Front. Supply lines stretched thin, ammunition ran low, and German counterattacks grew more desperate. Every inch of regained territory cost blood. In this shifting landscape, the night witches were no longer just a harassment unit. Their missions became essential components of coordinated offensives, disabling rail yards, destroying command posts, and sabotaging ammunition dumps. But with success came greater danger. The Germans had adapted. They began constructing rings of anti-aircraft fire, searchlight clusters, and rapid response fighter patrols specifically designed to trap PO-2 bombers. And still, the women flew. Not because they were fearless, but because they were needed. The death traps below. The German 88mm guns were the most feared weapon on the front. They could fire a shell that reached high-altitude bombers and obliterate a low-flying canvas biplane with a single hit. The night witches had almost no protection against this. On certain nights, the sky became a cage of fire. Searchlights crossed like swords. Tracers spiraled upward like burning snakes. Shells burst in mid-sky with force that shattered wooden wings. Smoke obscured the moonlight they relied on for navigation. The women learned to read the enemy's routines. They learned to sense danger before they saw it. The smell of burning cordite, the pause between searchlight sweeps, the angle of a fighter's engine noise rising behind them. And through this crucible, the Night Witches evolved into some of the most skilled night pilots the war had ever seen. The sisters who fell. For every successful mission, there were losses, and each loss carved a permanent ache into the regiment. There was Sergeant Marina Raskova, one of the founders of the Women's Air Units, killed in a crash during a storm, her plane buried under snow. There were Antonia Khudyakova and Yevgenia Zhigalenko, whose PO-2 was struck by a volley of machine gun fire, sending both into the dark forest below. There were crews who vanished entirely, no wreckage, no smoke trail, no final radio message, just silence. The regiment held a small ritual for every fallen sister. They would gather near the airstrip at dawn, the sky turning pink above them. A commander would read the pilot's name. A single flower, often plucked from frozen ground, was placed on an empty crate representing the missing plane. And then they flew that night, because grief could not halt the war, and because each mission flown in their memory felt like a promise fulfilled. The night of 42 sorties. One night in late summer of 1943, the regiment received intelligence that German armored columns were amassing along a wooded ridge near the Meuse River. If those tanks broke through, Soviet forces would collapse in that sector. The Night Witches prepared for their largest coordinated action to date. Crews strapped bombs beneath the wings with hands numb from exhaustion. Mechanics checked wires, patched holes, tightened bolts. Commanders reviewed maps by lantern light. Then the order came: launch. What followed was a night no one in the regiment ever forgot. Sortie after sortie, the PO-2s took off. They flew low enough to feel tree branches scrape their landing gear. They released bombs on tank concentrations, supply convoys, and hidden artillery nests. Each time they landed, they barely had minutes before lifting off again. By dawn, they had completed 42 bombing missions in a single night. Several planes returned with holes in their wings. One landed on a flat tire. One clipped a treetop during a low pass but somehow limped home. But they returned. The German armored assault never happened. The ridge held. When the Nazis sent their best. As the women's reputation spread, the Luftwaffe dispatched specialist night fighter units to intercept them. The most dangerous were the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and the Ju-88, aircraft equipped with radar, heavy armament, and pilots skilled in nocturnal combat. Compared to these predators, the Night Witches were flying toys. Yet the women had a secret advantage: speed, or rather the lack of it. Their biplanes flew so slowly that German fighters often overshot them, unable to reduce their own speed enough to stay behind. The wooden frames also produced a minimal radar signature, making detection nearly impossible. When German fighters did appear, the women flew dangerously close to the ground, weaving between trees, diving toward rivers, or slipping into valleys where radar couldn't reach. Their survival depended entirely on instinct, and they trusted their instincts with their lives. The pair who outwitted a night fighter. One mission became legendary. Pilots Irina Sebrova and Natalia Mechlin were returning from a raid when a German Ju-88 locked on their position. Its spotlight swept across the sky, hunting for movement. Rather than flee, Irina cut her engine. The PO-2 went silent. The Ju-88 overshot, confused. Irina waited, counting seconds, feeling altitude drop. When the German fighter banked for another pass, she restarted the engine, banking sharply and skimming just above the treetops. The Ju-88 tried again, too fast, too heavy, too high. Irina barely cleared a hill. The German fighter struck the hill and exploded in a fireball. The next morning, a smoking crater marked the spot. The women of the regiment gathered around Irina and Natalia when they returned. No speech was needed.
Their survival said everything. Life between missions. Despite the night terrors and close calls, the night witches found ways to remain human. They washed their faces in tin cups of melted snow. They laughed loudly at jokes that weren't funny. They rewrote the lyrics of wartime songs to tease each other. They patched uniforms with mismatched fabric until they resembled quilts. Many kept diaries, written quickly in the dim light of lanterns, capturing the fleeting moments of warmth that existed amidst a world of fire. One wrote, "Fear is a visitor, but courage is the home we live in." Another, "Tonight the sky was full of death, but also stars." They were soldiers, yes, but they were also young women trying to stay alive long enough to see peace again. Approaching the fall of 1943. By the end of 1943, the Soviet push westward was accelerating. The night witches now operated from improvised forward airfields, often nothing more than flattened meadows or muddy road clearings. The German forces were withdrawing, but they were far from defeated. Their anti-aircraft batteries grew more concentrated, their night patrols more aggressive, their searchlight grids more coordinated. And yet, the night witches adapted again. They created new formations, new approach angles, new glide paths that confused enemy gunners. They learned to cut their engines earlier, extend their glides longer, and use terrain shadows as shields. Experience turned them into masters, masters of silence, masters of the dark, masters of survival. The day they met the Supreme Commander. In the winter of 1943, Marshal Clement Voroshilov visited their forward camp. Snow covered the airfield in uneven drifts. Planes sat frost-white under the pale sun. The women stood in formation, boots planted firmly in the frozen mud. Voroshilov toured their aircraft, astonished at the holes patched with cloth, the makeshift wiring repairs, the worn propellers. He asked one mechanic, "Where do you get your replacement parts?" She replied, "We make them." He nodded slowly, realizing he stood among warriors who had defied all logic and expectation. By the end of the visit, he issued a formal commendation for their courage. It would not be their last.
By early 1944, the Night Witches had become one of the most feared, respected, and battle-proven air regiments on the Eastern Front. The Soviet advance was pushing westward, and the once defensive war had turned into an unrelenting pursuit of retreating German forces. The Night Witches, now veterans with hundreds of sorties each, were about to enter the most intense, exhausting, and defining year of their entire wartime service. The long road west. With every kilometer the Red Army reclaimed, the Night Witches moved their improvised airfields closer to the front. They slept less, flew more, repaired planes in harsher conditions, and endured longer supply shortages. Airfields were so temporary that many lasted only a week. Some lasted a single night. The ground crews improvised constantly. Makeshift workbenches built from broken fence posts, fuel barrels buried in snowbanks to keep them from freezing solid, torn fabric patched with whatever cloth they could salvage, propellers reshaped with rasps when metal replacements ran out. Through all of it, they kept the POV-2s flying, because the Red Army's movement depended on them. Every bridge crossed, every town liberated, every German counterattack broken. Somewhere behind those events were the black silhouettes of POV-2 bombers drifting silently overhead. The terrifying advance into Belarus. The summer of 1944 brought one of the largest Soviet offensives of the war, Operation Bagration. The Germans had fortified Belarus with every possible defense. Anti-aircraft batteries spaced every few kilometers, camouflaged bunkers dug deep into birch forests, searchlight grids forming blinding walls of white, night patrol fighters scanning the sky like hawks. The Night Witches were assigned missions to open the offensive, destroy supply supply depots, disable road junctions, crippled German communication lines. The difficulty of these operations was beyond anything they had faced. Each bombing run required flying across swampy lowlands where ground fog hid trees until the last second, navigating around entire forests illuminated by German searchlights, crossing rivers where anti-aircraft fire created literal curtains of explosions, and yet they struck every target assigned. German command reports from this period complained bitterly. These women pilots appear as ghosts. We hear nothing, then suddenly our fuel stores explode. We cannot stop them. The Night Witches had evolved into a force capable of crippling an entire army's mobility. The night the sky turned red. One of the most legendary missions occurred near the Berezina River, where German forces had concentrated ammunition stores to supply their defense. The Night Witches attacked over and over, dozens of sorties in a single night. Their bombs ignited the depots in a chain reaction. Witnesses reported flames climbing higher than church steeples, black smoke rising like thunderheads, German gun crews abandoning their posts in panic. By dawn, the Germans had lost the supplies they needed to maintain their lines. Entire sections of the front collapsed, and the Night Witches flew home with planes scorched from flying through the smoke clouds. The relationships that held them together. The regiment now consisted of women who had shared 3 years of unimaginable hardship. They were no longer wide-eyed cadets from flight school. They were seasoned pilots, masters of night warfare, and sisters. They celebrated victories together with whatever they could find, burning pine branches for warmth, passing around tiny mugs of thin tea, laughing under the stars. They mourned losses together too, kneeling in the mud beside a smoking crater, touching a torn piece of fabric that used to be part of a wing. They wrote each other's families. They shared boots, scarves, gloves. They traded ration bread for medicine. They spent their rare quiet moments combing one another's hair, humming old songs, pretending for a few minutes that the world was not burning. This sisterhood became their armor. The final winter. By the winter of 1944-1945, the Night Witches were operating in Poland, harassing German positions retreating towards the Oder River. But the conditions were brutal. The cold froze fuel pumps, engine oil, latches, fingers. Their nightly missions involved flying over forests where snowflakes glittered like sparks in the moonlight. Below them, the war was collapsing. German soldiers marched in retreat, tanks abandoned, armored trains derailed. Yet the German anti-aircraft defenses remained lethal. Several planes were lost to hidden flak nests. One was shot down while attempting to rescue a wounded crew. Another vanished during a snowstorm, lost to the dark river below. Each loss cut deeply, but each night the POV-2s rose again into the frozen sky. The night they bombed Berlin's outskirts. It was late April 1945. Berlin was a city under siege, glowing orange with fire and collapsing masonry. The Night Witches had advanced westward, now close enough to strike outlying defensive zones supporting the capital. Their missions were surgical: disrupt communication posts, destroy supply wagons, drop flares for Soviet artillery, blind enemy positions with smoke charges. These operations required flying lower than ever before, sometimes only 50 meters above the ground. Searchlights swept across the suburbs like slow-moving sabers of light, but the Night Witches slipped between them. One mission involved dropping bombs on a crucial rail line feeding German forces in central Berlin. The POV-2s approached from the northeast, gliding silently across the treetops. Below them, Berlin crackled with gunfire. Explosions flickered like dying stars. The Night Witches released their bombs, turned hard south, and vanished again into the blackness. That mission was the moment Berlin's defenders realized, even on the edge of total collapse, the Soviets were still sending their ghosts. The war's last breath. On May 8, 1945, the guns fell silent. VE Day.
The Night Witches had flown over 24,000 sorties, more than any other Soviet bomber regiment. Their accomplishments were staggering. 23 women awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Thousands of tons of bombs dropped. Entire enemy movements halted. Countless lives saved by their precision strikes. Their losses were heavy, but their courage was immortal. When the war ended, the surviving pilots returned home not to parades or fanfare, but to quiet cities and uncertain futures. Their regiment was dissolved, their planes put away, their uniforms packed into trunks, and yet the legacy they left behind echoed across generations. Epilogue: The Legacy of the Night Witches. The Germans never forgot them. Soviet men who fought beside them never forgot them. Historians never forgot them. Today, the story of the Night Witches is told not as a footnote, but as a symbol of fearless courage, ingenious tactics, unbreakable sisterhood, the resilience of women who refuse to be underestimated. They entered the war as young cadets. They ended it as legends. And somewhere over the forests, rivers, and fields they once flew, the whisper of wooden wings still drifts through the night. The Night Witches, the women who turned darkness into a weapon and struck fear into one of the most powerful armies on Earth.